There is a clay tablet resting in a museum basement in Baghdad. It has not been touched in 37 years. Dust settles upon its surface like snow falling on a forgotten grave. The cuneiform pressed into its face speaks of kings who ruled for 40,000 years, numbers so impossible that scholars filed it away and never looked back. But the tablet remains, silent, patient, waiting for someone to believe what it remembers. Something older than curiosity brought you to this moment. Perhaps it was the quiet hours before sleep when the noise of the modern world finally dims and you can hear something else, a rhythm. A pulse buried beneath the concrete and glass of everything you were taught to call civilization. That rhythm has always been there in the architecture of ancient temples, in the precision of stones cut before bronze existed, in the flood myths whispered across continents that never touched. It beats like a second heartbeat you forgot you had. What if the beginning was never the beginning? What if every city you've ever walked through, every street, every foundation, every monument to human progress sits atop the bones of something older, something that rose, flourished, and fell so completely that we mistake its ruins for bedrock? What if civilization is not a line climbing upward, but a wheel turning through ash, and memory building, and forgetting, rising and drowning again and again across millennia we cannot count? The evidence is not hidden. It has been buried in excavation reports for a century, dismissed as anomaly, filed under unexplained. Tonight we pull those files from the shadow. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper. Close your eyes now and let the world you know dissolve at its edges, softening like watercolour bleeding into wet paper, until all that remains is the darkness behind your eyelids and the sound of my voice drifting through it like smoke through an empty cathedral. We are going down tonight, not quickly, never quickly, but the way sediment descends through, still water grain by grain, thought by thought, breath by breath, until we reach a place where time moves differently, where centuries feel like heartbeats, where the bones of forgotten worlds lie stacked beneath our feet, like pages in a book no one remembers how to read. Feel the air around you change as we begin our descent into deep time. It grows cooler now, damper, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth, that smell you recognize from caves and old basements, and the moments just after rain breaks open sun-baked soil. This is the perfume of depth, the cologne of stone that has not seen sunlight in 10,000 years, and as you breathe it in slowly, letting it coat the back of your throat with its ancient dust, know that you are breathing the same air that filled the lungs of people whose names were never written down, whose languages dissolved like sugar in the ocean of time, whose entire civilizations now exist only as compressed layers of clay and ash beneath parking lots and shopping centres and the foundations of cities that believe themselves to be new. Picture yourself standing at the edge of an excavation pit in southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers once braided together across a plain so fertile that ancient scribes called it the land between the waters. It is just before dawn, and the sky holds that particular shade of purple that exists only in the minutes before the sun remembers its duty, a colour that feels less like light and more like the memory of a light bruised and tender and impossibly old. The air is still around you, not peaceful still, but waiting, still, the kind of stillness that precedes revelation, and below you the pit drops 15 metres into the earth, where shadows pool like spilled ink at the bottom. You can see the exposed layers of human occupation stretching back through millennia along the walls of this excavation, each stratum telling its story in the language of colour and texture that geologists and archaeologists have learned to read like ancient scripture. The pale yellow speaks of wind-blown sand accumulating over abandoned streets. The darker brown whispers of organic decay, where markets once bustled with merchants and craftsmen. The reddish tinge remembers fire, baked mud brick from homes where families slept and dreamed, and the grey-white sediment records the floods that rose without warning and drowned civilizations that thought themselves permanent. Each layer is a chapter, each colour is a sentence, and together they compose a history far older and stranger than any textbook has dared to print. But there is something else at the bottom of this pit, something the archaeologists have cordoned off with string and small flags, something they photograph from multiple angles but do not discuss in their official reports or mention in their published papers, Beneath the oldest recognized layer, beneath what textbooks confidently call the beginning of civilization, lies another floor smoother and more precise than anything above it, cut from stone that does not match any local quarry within hundreds of kilometers. The joints between these foundation stones are so tight that a razor blade cannot slip between them, a precision that supposedly primitive people should not have possessed, a craftsmanship that exceeds the work of later civilizations with access to metal tools and mathematical knowledge. It should not be there, and yet it is patient and undeniable, waiting for an explanation that conventional archaeology cannot provide. Let that impossibility settle into your bones like cold settling into stone on a winter night, and let it rest there unexplained while we continue our descent through atmosphere and time toward other sites, where the same impossible precision waits in darkness. Now the scene shifts around you, and you feel the temperature drop further as we travel north and backward, ascending mountain ranges that were once seabeds, crossing frozen tundras that were once tropical forests, filled with creatures whose bones now fuel our automobiles. We are in southeastern Turkey, now on a hillside that local farmers have ploughed around for generations, without ever understanding what lay beneath their barley fields, and the year is 1994, though years mean less and less the deeper we go into the buried past. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stands at the edge of a trench with trembling hands, and he is not shaking from the cold, though the morning air bites at exposed skin with the sharp teeth of a Turkish autumn. He trembles because of what his team has uncovered, because of the slow comprehension dawning in his trained mind that everything he learned in graduate school about the origins of civilization may be fundamentally catastrophically wrong. Massive T-shaped pillars of limestone rise from the earth like the fingers of giants, reaching up through centuries of accumulated soil, each pillar standing 3 to 6 meters tall and weighing between 10 and 20 tons, arranged in circles with geometric precision toward points on the horizon where specific stars rose 11,600 years ago. The surfaces of these megaliths are carved with bas-reliefs of animals, rendered with artistic sophistication that defies explanation. Foxes and serpents, wild boar and vultures, scorpions and aurochs, depicted with anatomical accuracy and symbolic complexity that suggests not primitive experimentation, but confident mastery of a tradition already old when these stones were carved. According to every model of human development, the people who built Göbekli Tepe should have been small bands of nomadic hunters, incapable of organized labor on this scale. People without agriculture or permanent settlements, or the social structures necessary to coordinate the quarrying, transportation, and erection of 20-ton stones. Yet here the stones stand arranged in astronomical alignments that required generations of careful observation to calculate, decorated with art, that required specialized craftsmen to create, positioned with engineering precision, that required advanced planning to achieve. The air at Göbekli Tepe carries a different quality than the air in Iraq, thinner and sharper scented with wild thyme and the distant memory of snow that still caps the mountains visible on the horizon. But beneath that freshness lies the same mineral depth, the same stone breadth, the same impossible antiquity that seeps upward through every excavation site, where humans have dug deep enough to disturb the sleep of ages. And there are so many sites scattered across this planet where the same story repeats itself, where the same impossible foundations wait beneath the floors of known history, where the same questions accumulate like dust in corners that archaeologists prefer not to sweep. Drift with me now across continents and oceans, skimming the surface of the earth like a bird riding thermals at the edge of sleep, and see the coastline of Gujarat in western India, where fishing boats rock gently above structures that sonar has mapped, but no diver has fully explored. Geometric formations of cut stone rest 40 meters beneath the Arabian Sea in waters that were dry land 12,000 years ago, when the Ice Age held the oceans in frozen captivity, and coastlines extended kilometers beyond their present positions. See the seafloor off Yonaguni in Japan, where terraced platforms and right-angled steps descend into blue darkness, dismissed by cautious geologists as natural erosion, but haunting in their symmetry, their repetition, their resemblance to the stepped pyramids of cultures that supposedly developed independently thousands of years later and thousands of miles away across waters no ancient boat could have crossed. This is the atmosphere we enter tonight, not the air of any single place, but the accumulated weight of buried evidence pressing upward against the thin crust of accepted history, like magma pressing against the underside of continental plates. It is an atmosphere of questions unanswered, of foundations unexplained, of civilizations that rose and flourished and fell and left behind only stone too heavy to move, and mysteries too large to fit inside our current understanding of what humans were capable of before history began to write itself down. The night is deep now. The world above has gone quiet, and somewhere beneath every city, every temple, every monument to human achievement, older stones wait in darkness, patient as only stone can be, knowing that time is on their side. The evidence does not announce itself with trumpets or demand attention with dramatic revelations, but instead accumulates quietly in the margins of academic journals and the footnotes of excavation reports, settling layer upon layer like sediment, drifting to the bottom of a still lake, where it waits for someone patient enough to read what time has written in the language of stone and ash and bone. This is how truth often arrives, not as a sudden flood that sweeps away everything we thought we knew, but as a slow tide rising imperceptibly, until one day we look around and discover that the shoreline of certainty has moved far from where we remembered standing, and the ground beneath our assumptions has become saturated with evidence we can no longer ignore. In 1922, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient Sumerian city of Ur when his team broke through the floor of what they believed to be the oldest occupation level into something that should not have existed beneath it. They found a layer of clean water deposited clay nearly 3 meters thick, the unmistakable signature of a catastrophic flood. And beneath that flood layer they found more artifacts, more pottery, more building foundations, more evidence of organized human settlement that predated everything above it by centuries or millennia. Woolley had expected to find bedrock, the natural bottom of human history, in that location, but instead he found continuation evidence that civilization did not begin where the textbook said it began, that the story extended backward into depths no one had thought to explore, because no one had believed there was anything to find. The same pattern repeated itself at Eridu, the city that Sumerian texts themselves identified as the oldest settlement in their tradition, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, according to records carved into clay 4,000 years ago. Excavators working through the 20th century uncovered 18 distinct occupation levels beneath the visible ruins, each layer separated from the next by flood deposits or destruction debris, each level showing evidence of organized society stretching back to at least 5,400 BCE and possibly much further into the unrecorded past. The deepest levels revealed not primitive huts but sophisticated temple architecture, drainage systems and urban planning that suggested these were not people learning to build civilization for the first time, but people who already knew what they were doing, people working from templates and traditions inherited from somewhere else, from someone else from a time before the floods erased the memory of origins. The evidence is not confined to Mesopotamia, but spreads across the ancient world like cracks spreading through ice, stressed beyond its capacity to remain solid and unified. At Jericho in the Jordan Valley excavations revealed a massive stone tower, 10 meters tall, dating to approximately 9,400 BC, 3,000 years before the pyramids, 4,000 years before Stonehenge, 6,000 years before the earliest Sumerian cities, and this tower was not a crude pile of rocks assembled by primitive hunter-gatherers, but a carefully constructed monument, requiring organized labor architectural planning and social coordination on a scale that supposedly did not exist in that era. The tower at Jericho was later deliberately buried by its own builders, filled in and covered over, as if to preserve it, to protect it, to hide it from something coming, or to save it for someone arriving later who would understand its significance. At Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, archaeologists uncovered 9,000 years of continuous human occupation, compressed into layers of mud brick houses, built directly on top of earlier mud brick houses, generation after generation, maintaining the exact footprint of the original settlement, as if the ground itself were sacred, as if moving even a few meters from the established boundaries would sever some connection to the deep past that the inhabitants could not afford to lose. The oldest levels at Çatalhöyük contained elaborate wall paintings, sophisticated textiles, obsidian mirrors polished to reflective perfection, and evidence of long-distance trade networks extending hundreds of kilometers, none of which fits the conventional model of isolated Neolithic villages slowly stumbling toward complexity through trial and error over thousands of years. These people arrived with skills already developed, with traditions already established, with knowledge already accumulated somewhere else, before they settled in this place and began building upward toward the present. The evidence extends beneath the waves as well into waters that were dry land during the last ice age, when sea level stood 120 meters lower than they do today, exposing vast coastal plains that would have been prime real estate for early human populations seeking the moderate climates and abundant resources that shorelines provide. Marine archaeologists using sonar and submersibles have documented anomalous formations off the coasts of India, Japan, Cuba, and the Mediterranean geometric structures, apparent walls, possible roads, and what look like building foundations resting at depth that place them above water, only during the Pleistocene epoch more than 11,000 years ago. Each discovery is explained away individually as natural geological formation, as coincidental erosion patterns, as wishful thinking projected onto random rock. But the explanations grow thinner with each new find, and the pattern grows stronger, and the weight of accumulated evidence presses harder against the ceiling of acceptable interpretation. Carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis tell a story that does not match the narrative we have been taught, a story of sophistication appearing before its supposed prerequisites of complexity, emerging without the expected developmental stages of knowledge, existing in places and times where the conventional timeline insists there should only be primitive simplicity. The Sumerian king list records rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years before a great flood reset civilization numbers that historians dismiss as mythological exaggeration, but that might encode actual time spans measured in ways we no longer understand. The geological record confirms that catastrophic flooding events occurred repeatedly at the end of the last ice age as glacial dams burst and ice sheets collapsed, releasing waters that would have inundated low-lying civilizations within generations or even within single human lifetimes, erasing cities and drowning histories, and leaving only fragments for survivors to carry into the highlands, where they would rebuild and remember and eventually forget that they were rebuilding at all. The evidence is not hidden, it has been accumulating in plain sight for a century, catalogued and photographed and filed away in archives, where it waits for the framework of interpretation to expand enough to accommodate what it reveals. Beneath the cities we know lie the foundations of cities we do not know. Beneath the history we have written lies a history we have not yet learned to read. The sediment keeps settling layer upon layer, and the truth keeps rising slow but inexorable like water, finding its level in the darkness underground. There is a moment in every field of knowledge when the accumulated weight of exceptions begins to exceed the carrying capacity of the rule, when the footnotes grow longer than the main text, when the anomalies multiply faster than the explanations designed to contain them, and the careful architecture of accepted understanding develops cracks that no amount of academic plaster can permanently conceal. We have arrived at such a moment in our understanding of human origins, a moment when the evidence that does not fit has become too heavy to keep filing away in drawers marked unexplained or requires further study or advance for its time, and the cracks in our timeline have begun to connect into a pattern that suggests the timeline itself may need to be redrawn from its very foundations. Consider the precision of ancient stonework that appears in the earliest layers of excavation sites around the world, craftsmanship so exact that modern engineers struggle to replicate it, even with diamond-tipped tools and laser-guided measurements. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, stone blocks weighing over 100 tons were cut with surfaces so flat that the deviation from perfect plane measures less than 1/10 of a millimetre across spans of several metres, and these blocks were fitted together with interlocking joints so complex that they resemble the pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle, designed by minds that understood geometry at a level supposedly not achieved until thousands of years later. The official timeline places Pumapunku's construction around 536 CE, but the weathering patterns on the stones, the astronomical alignments of the structures and the depth of sediment accumulation suggest an age far greater, and the technology required to create such precision suggest capabilities we cannot explain with the tools and knowledge available to any known ancient culture. The anomaly deepens when we examine the logistics of ancient construction, the sheer improbability of quarrying, transporting and positioning massive stones, using only the methods that conventional archaeology permits these builders to have possessed. The largest stones at Baalbek in Lebanon weigh over 1,000 tons, each heavier than any object modern construction equipment has ever lifted in a single piece. Yet, they were somehow cut from bedrock, moved hundreds of meters, and placed with millimeter precision into foundation walls that have survived earthquakes for millennia. The Temple of Jupiter built atop these foundations is Roman dated and documented, but the platform beneath it is something else entirely, something older and stranger, something the Romans themselves did not claim to have built and may not have been capable of building. We know who constructed the temple above, but the foundation below belongs to builders whose identity has been erased from history, leaving only their impossible stones as testimony to capabilities we cannot account for. At Göbekli Tepe, the anomalies compound upon themselves until the weight becomes almost unbearable for the conventional framework to support. Here we find not merely sophisticated stonework, but astronomical alignments that required centuries of careful observation to calculate artistic traditions that required generations of accumulated skill to develop an organizational complexity that required social structures we insist did not exist among hunter-gatherers of that era. The site was not built quickly by a single inspired generation, but developed over at least 1,500 years with newer circles constructed around and sometimes directly atop older ones. Each iteration maintaining the same architectural principles, the same symbolic vocabulary, the same cosmic orientation evidence of continuous institutional knowledge transmitted across dozens of generations without the benefit of writing, without permanent settlements, without any of the infrastructure that supposedly makes such transmission possible. The anomaly is not that Göbekli Tepe exists, but that everything we think we know about the development of human civilization says it should not exist, could not exist, and yet there it stands, 11,600 years old, waiting for us to revise our assumptions rather than continue insisting the evidence must be mistaken. The Antikythera mechanism recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck in 1901 presents another crack in the smooth surface of accepted history. A bronze device containing at least 30 interlocking gears that together formed an analog computer capable of predicting eclipses, tracking lunar phases, and calculating the positions of planets decades in advance. Nothing remotely comparable appears in the archaeological record for another 1,400 years, unless some medieval clockmakers in Europe began developing similar gear systems, and the sophistication of the mechanism's design suggests not a lucky first attempt, but the refinement of a tradition already mature, already optimized, already drawing on knowledge accumulated over generations of development that left no other trace. The Antikythera mechanism is not a beginning, but an ending. A final surviving example of a technological lineage that flourished and then vanished so completely that this single corroded artifact remained to perplex archaeologists for a century, before X-ray imaging revealed the complexity hidden inside its encrusted shell. The anomalies appear in text as well as stone in records that describe events and timescales, and capabilities that historians have trained themselves to read as metaphor or exaggeration, rather than confront as potentially literal accounts of a past more ancient and more accomplished than our models permit. The Sumerian king list records 8 kings ruling 5 cities for a combined 241,200 years before a great flood swept over the land, and kingship had to be lowered again from heaven to restart civilization numbers that seem absurd until you consider that the same document using the same format and the same matter-of-fact tone goes on to record post-flood dynasties whose rulers have been independently verified by archaeology, whose cities have been excavated, whose names appear on multiple tablets in multiple archives. The scribes who wrote the king list did not distinguish between the pre-flood and post-flood sections as myth versus history. They presented both as continuous record, and the question of why we accept the second half while dismissing the first reveals more about our assumptions than about the reliability of the ancient scribes. Egyptian priests told the Greek historian Herodotus that their civilization had maintained continuous records for over 11,000 years, a claim he recorded faithfully even as later historians dismissed it as nationalist exaggeration designed to impress gullible foreigners. But the geological evidence now confirms that 11,000 years ago, precisely when the Egyptian priests said their record-keeping began, was exactly when the last ice age ended, when sea levels rose catastrophically, when the climate stabilized into the patterns that would eventually make the Nile Valley fertile and habitable. Perhaps the priests were not exaggerating. Perhaps they were remembering. Perhaps their records once extended back to a time before the flood, before the reset, before the amnesia that settled over human memory like silt, settling over drowned cities, and what fragments survived were dismissed as myth by scholars who had already decided what was possible and refused to let evidence disturb their conclusions. The cracks are widening now, connecting to each other across continents and millennia, forming a web of anomalies that no longer fits inside the container of conventional explanation. The precision that should not exist, the logistics that should not work, the knowledge that should not have been accumulated, the records that should not be believed, they are not isolated mysteries but symptoms of a single underlying condition, evidence that the story we have been telling ourselves about human origins is incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. Something is missing from our timeline, something large, something that would explain why the oldest foundations are often the most sophisticated, why knowledge seems to appear fully formed rather than develop gradually, why every ancient culture remembers a time before the flood, when things were different, when gods walked among men, when civilization existed in forms we can no longer imagine. The anomaly is not in the evidence. The anomaly is in our refusal to see what the evidence is telling us. There is a kind of silence that speaks louder than any voice, a silence that exists not because nothing happened, but because what happened was too large to survive intact, too catastrophic to leave witnesses, too complete in its erasure, to permit anything but fragments and whispers and the faint impressions of absence where presence once stood. This is the silence that hangs over the millennia between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, a gap in the human record so vast and so deep that we have learned to walk around it, rather than peer into its darkness and ask what it might contain. We have given this silence names that make it seem natural: the Mesolithic, the transition period, the era of adaptation, but names do not fill the void they label, and the silence remains patient and immense, waiting for someone brave enough to listen to what it is not saying. The archaeological record of this period is not merely incomplete, but systematically impoverished in ways that cannot be fully explained by the normal processes of decay and erosion that thin the evidence of any ancient era. We have abundant artifacts from the Upper Paleolithic, the period before the silence, when humans painted caves, with breathtaking artistry and carved figurines with sophisticated understanding of form and proportion, and left behind tools and ornaments and burial sites across Europe and Asia and Africa in quantities sufficient to fill museums. And we have abundant artifacts from the Neolithic, the period after the silence, when agriculture and permanent settlements and pottery and textile production appeared with suspicious suddenness across multiple continents, as if someone had flipped a switch and illuminated capabilities that had been waiting in darkness. But between these two well-documented eras stretches a shadow 6,000 years long, and within that shadow the evidence thins to almost nothing, as if humanity itself had retreated into hiding, or been reduced to remnants too small to leave traces we know how to find. The standard explanation for this silence is environmental. The end of the Ice Age disrupted ecosystems, forced populations to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, scattered communities into mobile bands that left few permanent traces of their passage through landscapes that were themselves transforming from tundra to forest, from grassland to desert, from dry plain to shallow sea. This explanation is not wrong, but it is insufficient because it assumes that the silence represents an absence of activity rather than an absence of evidence that nothing much happened during these millennia, because we have found so little proof that anything happened. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when the places most likely to contain evidence are precisely the places most likely to have been destroyed by the very catastrophes that define this era. Consider where coastal populations would have lived during the Ice Age when sea level stood 120 metres lower than today, and vast continental shelves extended the shorelines of every continent by tens or hundreds of kilometres. These would have been the most desirable territories for human settlement. Moderate climates buffered by maritime influence, abundant marine resources, navigable waterways connecting communities along coastlines that stretched unbroken for thousands of kilometres. If sophisticated societies existed during the late Pleistocene, this is where they would have flourished, where they would have built, where they would have left the most substantial evidence of their existence. And this is precisely where we cannot look, because these lands now lie beneath fathoms of salt water, buried under millennia of marine sediment, accessible only to expensive underwater expeditions that have mapped less than 5% of the ocean floor in any meaningful detail. The silence is not empty, it is drowned. The gaps in our record are not gaps in human activity, but gaps in human access to the places where that activity occurred. We have been searching for the origins of civilization on dry land because that is where we live, and where our instruments work and where our funding permits us to dig, but the origins we seek may rest in the darkness beneath the waves, preserved in sediment or scattered by currents, or simply dissolved by 10,000 years of salt water, working on stone and bone and whatever organic materials might have recorded the lives of people whose very existence we have not yet learned to suspect. The inland sites that do survive from this silent era tell a story of fragmentation and preservation, rather than continuous development, as if scattered survivors were maintaining isolated pockets of knowledge against the encroaching amnesia of catastrophe and displacement. Göbekli Tepe appears at the end of this silence like a monument emerging from fog, sophisticated and sudden and unexplained by anything that immediately precedes it in the local archaeological sequence. The site does not represent invention, but preservation, not the beginning of symbolic thinking, and astronomical knowledge and monumental architecture, but the survival of these capabilities through an era that destroyed most evidence of their existence elsewhere. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not creating something new, they were remembering something old and coding it in stone, heavy enough to endure whatever had destroyed the lighter traces of the tradition they inherited. The silence extends to text, as well as artifact, to the written records that should exist, but do not to the archetypes that ancient historians described but that have never been found. The Library of Alexandria, before its destruction, reportedly contained records of human history extending back tens of thousands of years, chronicles that Egyptian and Babylonian priests claimed to have preserved from ages before, the flood documents that Greek scholars travelled thousands of miles to consult and copy, but that vanished when the library burned and burned again, until nothing remained but references to references, titles, without text, this silence of ash where knowledge once lived. We cannot know what those lost records contained, whether they would have confirmed or contradicted our assumptions about human origins, whether they preserved memories of civilizations we have forgotten, or whether they too were reconstructions based on fragments. Older, still layers of remembering and forgetting, extending backward into depths we cannot fathom. The silence teaches us something if we're willing to learn something about the fragility of memory and the patience required to listen for what is no longer being said. The absence in the record is not proof that nothing existed before the threshold of conventional history, just as the silence between heartbeats is not proof that the heart has stopped. Something beats in that darkness, something pulses beneath the sediment and the waves, and the accumulated assumptions of centuries of scholarship that decided in advance what was possible and stopped listening for evidence of anything else. The silence is not empty. The silence is full of everything. We have not yet learned to hear everything. We have not yet developed the instruments to detect everything that waits in the drowned places and the buried places and the places we have not thought to look because we were taught there was nothing there worth finding. Let the silence settle around you now like water settling in a still pool, and feel the weight of everything it contains, the civilizations dissolved, the knowledge dispersed, the memories scattered like seeds across continents by survivors who carried what they could and lost the rest as time and tide. and the long forgetting that followed the flood. Let us now do something that science rarely permits, and imagination often fears. Let us step backward through the silence, and into the world that existed before the waters rose, before the ice released its grip on the oceans, before the catastrophe that separates us from the deep past, like a curtain drawn across a stage where a previous act has ended, and the scenery is being changed. This is not fantasy but reconstruction, not invention but extrapolation from the fragments that survived, from the foundations that remain, from the knowledge that appeared too suddenly in too many places to have been invented fresh by people starting from nothing. Close your eyes and let the millennia fall away like veils, and see if you can glimpse what the world looked like when the forgotten epoch was not forgotten, but alive and breathing and unaware that it would soon be erased from everything except stone and memory and myth. The coastlines of this world would be unrecognizable to modern eyes, extending far beyond their present boundaries, across continental shelves that are now shallow seas, creating land bridges between continents that we think of as eternally separated, and opening harbours in locations that today lie kilometres offshore, beneath waters too deep for casual exploration. The Persian Gulf did not exist. It was a river valley fed by the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing through a landscape of fertile plains, where cities could have risen and flourished for millennia without leaving any trace we would find on present-day land. The Mediterranean was smaller, its coastlines extended by lowered sea levels, and the land bridge between Africa and Europe at Gibraltar was wider, easier to cross a corridor for ideas and people and technologies moving between continents that we imagine were isolated from each other. The world was connected in ways it would not be again until the age of sail, and if civilization existed in this epoch, it had highways we have lost and harbours we have drowned, and networks of exchange we can only infer from the impossible similarities that appear in cultures supposedly too distant to have contacted each other. Imagine a city in this world, not the crude collection of huts that conventional archaeology permits, but something closer to what the evidence of sudden sophistication suggests: a planned settlement with drainage systems and standardized construction and astronomical alignments built into its foundations, the kind of city that appears fully formed at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, as if the builders already knew what they were doing because they had done it before somewhere else. The streets would run in grids, oriented to cardinal directions. The buildings would be constructed from bricks of standardized dimensions, and at the center would stand a temple, or observatory, or both, combined a structure designed to track the movements of stars and predict the turning of seasons, with precision accumulated over centuries of careful watching. The people in this city would not think of themselves as primitive or early or foundational. They would simply be living their lives in a civilization they assumed would continue forever, as every civilization assumes until the moment it ends. The knowledge preserved in this forgotten epoch would have been practical as much as spiritual, encoded in traditions of building and planting and navigating, that required no writing because they were transmitted through apprenticeship and ritual, and the living memory of specialists who devoted their lives to maintaining what their predecessors had learned. They would have known the movements of stars well enough to predict eclipses and calculate equinoxes, because the astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa and dozens of other ancient sites required exactly this knowledge, and could not have been developed quickly by people just beginning to watch the sky. They would have known the properties of stone well enough to cut and transport blocks, weighing dozens of tons with precision. We struggle to match today because the evidence of such capabilities exists in the oldest layers of construction around the world, beneath the cruder work of later civilizations that built atop foundations they could not have created themselves. They would have known the patterns of seasons and floods and animal migrations well enough to manage resources across landscapes that required coordination between communities separated by hundreds of kilometers, because the sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations simultaneously suggests not independent invention, but the application of knowledge already possessed: seeds, already selected techniques, already refined by generations of experimentation we cannot trace. The people of this epoch would have had myths and stories and histories of their own records of their own past, extending backward into depths we cannot imagine, and they would have thought of themselves as the inheritors of traditions, older still links in a chain of transmission. Reaching back to origins they could no longer verify, but continued to honour in rituals whose original meanings had faded into formula and repetition. Every civilization eventually forgets where its knowledge came from and begins to believe it invented everything itself, and the forgotten epoch was surely no different. Surely contained its own forgotten epochs beneath it, layers of inheritance extending downward into time like the layers of occupation, extending downward into excavation pits, each generation standing atop the accumulated achievements of predecessors whose individual contributions had been absorbed into the anonymous mass of culture. We are not unique in our forgetting. We are simply the latest in a sequence of forgettings that may extend further back than we have yet developed the tools or the courage to explore. The end of this epoch would not have come suddenly in a single apocalyptic day, but gradually over generations as the climate shifted and the ice began to melt, and the coastlines began their long retreat toward their present positions. There would have been floods, yes, catastrophic inundations as glacial dams burst and released lakes of meltwater that had accumulated behind walls of ice for millennia, and these floods would have been remembered in the myths that every culture preserves the stories of divine punishment and chosen survivors, and the renewal of the world from a small remnant of the old. But the larger catastrophe was slower, and in some ways more complete, the steady rise of sea levels over centuries, the gradual drowning of coastal cities and harbours, and agricultural lands, the displacement of populations inland to higher ground, where they would have to rebuild with whatever knowledge and whatever materials they could carry from the homes they were abandoning to the advancing waters. Some would have preserved more than others, would have carried not just survival skills but the higher knowledge of astronomy and architecture, and social organisation that would later reappear with suspicious completeness in the earlier civilizations we recognise. These would become the sages of mythology, the bringers of civilization, the figures remembered in every culture as having arrived from elsewhere with gifts of knowledge that lifted humanity from darkness into order. They were not gods, and not aliens, but survivors, preservers, the living libraries of a world that was drowning, carrying what they could save into a future they hoped would remember them and honour what they had preserved. We are that future, and we've forgotten almost everything they tried to save. But the stones remember and the myths remember, and somewhere in the depths of our collective unconscious, we remember too, not clearly, not completely, but enough to feel a strange recognition when we stand before the impossible precision of ancient monuments and sense that we are looking at the work of relatives of ancestors, of people who are not primitive beginnings but sophisticated endings, the last witnesses to an epoch we have only just begun to suspect ever existed at all. The Earth breathes on timescales we cannot feel, inhaling ice ages that last 100,000 years, and exhaling warmth that transforms the planet's face so completely that maps drawn before the breath would be useless. After it, coastlines, erased rivers, rerouted forests advancing across former tundra, and deserts blooming where glaciers once ground stone to powder. We live in the pause between breaths in a moment of relative stability that feels permanent because human memory is too short to encompass the rhythms of geological time, but the planet remembers the rocks, remember the sediment layers. Remember, and what they remember is that change is not an exception to Earth's nature, but its fundamental expression that catastrophe is not a malfunction of planetary systems, but their recalibration, their return to balance after periods of accumulation have pushed beyond sustainable limits. The reset that ended the forgotten epoch was not punishment or accident, but physics. The inevitable consequence of ice sheets 3 kilometers thick, melting under the influence of orbital cycles and solar variations, and feedback loops that amplified small changes into transformations vast enough to reshape continents. For nearly 100,000 years, water had been locked in glaciers, covering much of North America and Europe and Asia, lowering sea levels by 120 meters and exposing land that would later drown, creating a world with different coastlines and different climates and different possibilities for human settlement. When the ice began to release its grip, it did not let go gently, but in surges and collapses that sent walls of meltwater cascading across landscapes, with force sufficient to carve new river channels overnight and deposit boulders the size of houses hundreds of kilometers from their origins, The geological evidence for these floods is written across the American Northwest in the channeled scablands, in the erratics scattered across northern Europe, in the submarine canyons carved by torrents of fresh water, pouring off continental shelves into ocean basins that rose to swallow everything the retreating ice exposed. The Younger Dryas period added complexity to this catastrophe, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions lasting nearly 1,300 years that interrupted the warming trend around 12,900 years ago, and created a false ending that must have seemed like salvation to populations already reeling from the changes around them. For over a millennium the cold returned, the ice stabilized, the coastlines stopped their retreat, and whatever civilizations had survived the initial disruptions might have believed the crisis had passed, and normal conditions would resume. Then, around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended with a rapidity that geological records describe as almost instantaneous temperatures, rising by 7 degrees Celsius within a single human lifetime, ice sheets collapsing and cascades of calving glaciers and bursting ice dams, sea levels lurching upward in pulses that would have drowned entire regions within generations. This was the flood that every culture remembers, not a metaphor for spiritual transformation, but a literal inundation that erased the coastal world and everything built upon it. The reset was not the end of humanity, but the end of a particular configuration of human civilization, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another in which survivors would carry forward whatever fragments of knowledge they could preserve, while abandoning everything too heavy or too complex or too dependent on infrastructure that no longer existed. Imagine the calculations that must have occurred in those generations of displacement, what to save and what to leave behind, what knowledge was essential, and what was merely ornamental, what traditions could survive in oral transmission, and what required physical records that could not be transported through landscapes of chaos and uncertainty. The choices made in those desperate years would determine what the future remembered, and what it forgot would shape the civilization that eventually emerged from the silence, and would never know how much had been lost in the selection process that catastrophe imposed upon the inheritance of the forgotten epoch. The earth did not intend cruelty in this reset any more than a forest intends cruelty when fire clears the underbrush and releases nutrients back into soil exhausted by centuries of accumulation. The planet operates on principles that include destruction as a necessary phase of renewal that recognize collapse not as failure, but as the precondition for new growth that understands stability itself as a temporary state between transformations rather than the natural condition of complex systems. What feels like apocalypse to creatures whose lives span decades is merely adjustment to a planet whose processes unfold across millennia, and the floods that drowned the forgotten epoch were the same floods that created the fertile river valleys where subsequent civilizations would rise, depositing sediments rich with the minerals that would make agriculture possible in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the Indus Valley and everywhere else. The survivors eventually settled and began the long work of rebuilding what had been lost. We are the children of that reset, the descendants of survivors who made it through the bottleneck and carried enough knowledge to restart the engines of civilization within a few thousand years of the catastrophe that should have erased everything. The speed of that recovery tells us something about what was preserved, not just survival skills, but organizational principles, not just practical techniques, but accumulated wisdom about how to structure societies and track seasons and coordinate labor toward goals larger than any individual could achieve. The reset did not destroy this knowledge completely, but scattered it, fragmented it, forced it through filters of selection that kept some elements and lost others according to criteria we can no longer reconstruct. What emerged on the other side was not the forgotten epoch restored, but something new built from its ruins. Civilization that remembered enough to rebuild quickly, but forgot enough to believe it was building. For the first time, standing on foundations it did not recognize as inheritance, and claiming as invention what was actually recovery. The breath continues. The earth exhales warmth into an interglacial period that will not last forever, and somewhere in the future another reset waits patient as geology, certain as physics, inevitable as the turning of cycles too large for human memory to hold. The past does not stay buried no matter how deeply we enter it beneath layers of sediment and centuries of forgetting, but instead rises through the present like groundwater seeping upward through soil invisible until it saturates everything. And suddenly we notice that the foundations are damp, with influences we cannot trace to any source we recognize. The forgotten epoch did not vanish completely when the waters rose and the survivors scattered it, dispersed into fragments that embedded themselves in every civilization that followed, echoes of the original sound bouncing off walls we did not know existed, reverberations that shape our world in ways we have stopped questioning, because they have always been there as far back as anyone can remember, which is not nearly as far back as the echoes themselves extend. Consider the 7-day week that organizes your life, the rhythm of work and rest that seems so natural you have probably never wondered why 7 rather than 5 or 10 or any other number that might divide time into manageable portions. There is no astronomical basis for the 7-day week. It does not align with lunar phases which cycle through roughly 29.5 days, nor with any solar phenomenon, nor with any natural rhythm that would make 7 an obvious choice for creatures seeking to organize their activities in harmony with celestial patterns. The week is Sumerian in origin, based on their sacred number 7, adopted by Babylonians and transmitted to Jews and inherited by Christians and Muslims, and eventually imposed upon the entire planet through colonialism and commerce. Until now it seems as inevitable as sunrise, as natural, as gravity, as unquestionable as the ground beneath your feet. But it is not natural, it is inherited. It is an echo of decisions made in the forgotten epoch, by people whose names we do not know, carried forward through the catastrophe, by survivors who preserve this organizing principle, along with everything else they managed to save, and we have been living inside their calendar ever since without recognizing it as the artifact of a vanished world that it truly is. The echoes extend into architecture as well, into the proportions and alignments and sacred geometries that appear in temples and monuments across cultures that supposedly developed independently without contact or influence. The ratio of height to base in the Great Pyramid of Giza encodes the mathematical constant pi with precision that would require advanced understanding of geometry to achieve deliberately, and the same proportions appear in structures built thousands of years later and thousands of miles away by civilizations that could not have copied the Egyptians because they did not know the Egyptians existed. Either these cultures independently discovered the same mathematical relationships and chose to encode them in the same architectural forms, a coincidence so improbable that statisticians would reject it as explanation, or they were drawing from a common source a shared inheritance of sacred proportion that predated all of them and survived the reset in the minds of builders who knew these ratios were important, even if they had forgotten exactly why. The echo persists in every temple oriented to solstice sunrise, in every monument, aligned to stellar north in every sacred precinct, whose dimensions encode relationships between earth and sky that required centuries of careful observation to discover and millennia of faithful transmission to preserve. The echo sounds in language itself, in words whose origins linguists trace backward, until the trail disappears into the silence before writing into the oral traditions that carried vocabulary across the catastrophe and deposited it in the earliest recorded languages already ancient and already mysterious. The Sumerian language has no known relatives, no family tree connecting it to other tongues, no evident origin in any linguistic tradition. We can identify, it appears, in the archaeological record, fully formed complex capable of expressing abstract concepts and recording administrative details, and preserving myths that themselves reference earlier ages, when gods walked among men and taught humanity the arts of civilization. The isolation of Sumerian suggests not that it evolved independently in Mesopotamia, but that it arrived there already developed, carried by migrants from somewhere else, preserved through the silence by speakers who maintained their linguistic heritage even as they lost access to the physical civilization that had produced it. We speak with echoes in our mouths, using grammatical structures and conceptual categories inherited from ancestors we cannot name, thinking thoughts shaped by linguistic frameworks that were ancient before the pyramids were new. The echo reverberates through our bodies as well, through genetic patterns that trace human migrations across continents, and through bottlenecks, where populations crash to small fractions of their former numbers before expanding again into the emptied landscapes left by catastrophe. The genetic evidence confirms that humanity passed through severe population reductions around the time of the Younger Dryas, that the human species contracted to perhaps a few tens of thousands of individuals scattered across refugia, where survival was possible while surrounding populations perished. The survivors carried forward particular genetic configurations that now appear in their descendants, which is to say in all of us, markers of passage through the filter of catastrophe that selected for certain traits and eliminated others, according to criteria that had nothing to do with long-term fitness and everything to do with luck and location, and the random factors that determine who lives and who dies when the world transforms faster than adaptation can follow. We are echoes ourselves, reverberations of people who made it through the reset, and carried forward not just their genes, but their knowledge, their organizational principles, their ways of measuring time and orienting temples and structuring societies around hierarchies that seemed natural because they had always existed as far back as anyone could remember. The forgotten epochs speaks through us every time we observe the 7-day week, every time we build in proportions that feel right, without knowing why, every time we gather in institutions whose structures replicate patterns established before history began recording itself. The echo never fades completely. It simply becomes so familiar that we stop hearing it as echo and start mistaking it for silence, for the natural state of things, for the way the world has always been, rather than the way it was made by people whose world ended so that ours could begin. Listen carefully in the stillness of this night, and you might hear it still, the reverberation of the forgotten epoch pulsing through everything we are and everything we have built, ancient and patient and waiting to be recognized at last. We have been taught to see history as a line stretching from primitive origins towards civilized destinations, a steady climb from darkness into light, from ignorance into knowledge, from the caves where our ancestors huddled against the cold, toward the climate-controlled towers where we now conduct the business of progress. This linear vision flatters us, placing us at the pinnacle of a trajectory that justifies our present, by making it the culmination of everything that came before the inevitable result of improvements accumulating across millennia until they produced the unprecedented achievement of modern civilization. But the evidence we have gathered in this long night tells a different story, traces a different geometry, reveals a shape that is not a line ascending but a wheel, turning, not progress toward a destination but circulation through phases that repeat, because they must. Because the conditions that produce civilization also contain the seeds of its collapse, and the conditions that follow collapse also contain the seeds of renewal. The pattern emerges when you stop looking at individual civilizations as unique achievements and start seeing them as instances of a recurring phenomenon, expressions of a template that manifests whenever certain conditions align and dissolves, whenever those conditions shift beyond the parameters that complex societies require. Sumeria rose in the Fertile Crescent between the rivers, flourished for millennia, and fell to invasion and environmental degradation that turned irrigated fields into salt-poisoned wastelands, incapable of supporting the populations that had grown dependent upon them. Egypt rose along the Nile, flourished for millennia, and fell to conquest and climate shifts that weakened the agricultural foundation upon which its monuments depended. Rome rose around the Mediterranean, flourished for centuries, and fell to a combination of overextension and plague and political fragmentation that shattered an empire into pieces that would spend the next 1,000 years trying to reassemble themselves. Each civilization believed itself permanent. Each civilization was wrong. The pattern does not care about our beliefs. It operates according to dynamics that transcend individual cultures and manifest wherever humans attempt to organize complexity beyond the carrying capacity of their environments or their institutions. The Mayans discovered this pattern in the jungles of Central America, building cities of remarkable sophistication that they eventually abandoned to the forest when drought and soil exhaustion and political collapse made urban life unsustainable. The Khmer discovered it at Angkor, constructing the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, and then walking away when the water management systems that sustained their population failed under the pressure of climate change and infrastructure decay. The ancestral Puebloans discovered it in the American Southwest, building elaborate cliff dwellings that they occupied for generations before migrating elsewhere, when the conditions that had made their civilization possible shifted into configurations that could no longer support it. These are not failures of imagination or effort or intelligence, but expressions of a pattern that operates beyond the control of any individual society, a rhythm of expansion and contraction that seems to be built into the very nature of complex systems, attempting to maintain themselves against the entropy that constantly works to dissolve them back into simpler forms. The pattern suggests that civilization is not a permanent achievement, but a temporary state, a configuration that emerges when conditions permit and dissipates when conditions change, leaving behind monuments and memories and fragments of knowledge that subsequent civilizations will inherit without fully understanding where they came from. The forgotten epoch that we have traced through tonight's journey was not the first civilization, but merely the most recent one to be erased before the historical record began, and the civilizations we know from history, Sumeria and Egypt and Greece and Rome, and all the others are not the final word, but merely the latest iterations of a cycle that has been turning since humans first had developed the capacity for complex social organization. We stand not at the end of history, but somewhere in the middle of a turn, inheritors of patterns established before the flood, and transmitters of those patterns to futures we cannot foresee, links in a chain that extends backward and forward beyond the reach of our documentation. The recognition of this pattern should not produce despair, but rather a kind of peace, an acceptance that the rise and fall of civilizations is not tragedy, but rhythm, not catastrophe, but respiration. The systole and diastole of a heartbeat that keeps time on scales too large for individual human lives to perceive. The forgotten epoch rose and fell, and from its fragments our known history emerged. Our known history will rise and fall in turn, and from its fragments something new will emerge that will inherit our knowledge without remembering our names, will use our discoveries without knowing who discovered them, will build upon foundations we laid, without recognizing them as inheritance rather than invention. This is not nihilism, but humility, not resignation, but perspective. The long view that comes from understanding that we are not the protagonists of a story that began with us, but participants in a pattern that was ancient before we were born, and will continue long after everything we have built has been buried beneath the sediment of ages yet to come. The wheel turns and the pattern repeats, but repetition is not futility. It is the structure through which existence perpetuates itself, the form that life takes when it organizes matter against entropy, and knows that entropy will eventually win each individual battle, while life continues to win the larger war simply by beginning again. Civilizations fall so that civilizations can rise. Knowledge is lost so that knowledge can be rediscovered. The cycle is not a prison but a process, not a trap but a teaching. And the lesson it offers to those patient enough to learn is that impermanence is not the enemy of meaning but its source. Everything we build matters precisely because it will not last forever, and the pattern that carries our achievements into futures we will never see is the closest thing to immortality that any civilization can achieve. We have been here before in other forms under other names, and we will be here again. And the pattern that connects all these iterations is the thread that makes history not a random sequence of disconnected events, but a tapestry woven from recurring themes that reveal to those with eyes to see the deep structure of human existence on a planet that breathes in cycles longer than memory can hold. The Earth has never destroyed without announcing its intentions. First, never reset without sending signals that those who knew how to read them could interpret as invitations to prepare, to move, to preserve what mattered most before the transformation arrived and made preservation impossible. The catastrophes that erased civilizations and drowned coastlines and buried cities beneath flood sediment were not ambushes sprung without warning, but conclusions to sequences of signs that accumulated over years and decades and sometimes centuries, patterns of change that observant populations could track and interpret and respond to if they possessed the knowledge and the willingness to believe what the patterns were telling them. The forgotten epoch did not end in a single afternoon of divine wrath, but over generations of mounting signals shifting migration routes of animals that had followed the same paths for millennia, changes in the timing of seasons that disrupted agricultural calendars, refined over centuries the slow retreat of coastlines that grandparents remembered as stable and grandchildren watched recede year after year into positions their maps had never recorded. The warnings were written in the behavior of birds whose flight patterns traced atmospheric changes, invisible to human senses but legible to creatures whose survival depended on reading the sky with precision we have forgotten how to achieve. They were written in the movements of fish whose spawning grounds shifted as water temperatures changed, and currents reorganized themselves according to dynamics that operated beneath the surface of awareness, but manifested in nets that came up emptier each season in catches that declined despite increased effort in species appearing in waters where they had never been seen, and disappearing from waters where they had always been abundant. The animals knew. They always know. Their bodies are instruments calibrated to frequencies of change that human civilization has learned to ignore in favor of the artificial stability created by technology and infrastructure that buffer us from variations our ancestors would have felt in their bones before they felt them anywhere else. The warnings were written in ice cores and tree rings and sediment layers that recorded fluctuations in climate with precision that modern scientists can now read like archives, each layer a page in a book that tells the same story. Repeatedly periods of stability punctuated by rapid transitions, long ages of consistent conditions, interrupted by decades of chaos when everything changed too fast for slow adapting systems to keep pace. The Younger Dryas event that ended the forgotten epoch left its signature in ice cores from Greenland, a sudden spike in certain isotopes that marks the moment when temperatures plunged and the brief warming that had begun to melt the glaciers reversed itself without warning, plunging the northern hemisphere back into conditions that must have seemed like punishment to populations who had begun to believe the Ice Age was finally ending. The ice cores record the end of the Younger Dryas as well, an equally sudden reversal that brought temperatures surging upward within decades, too fast for glaciers to melt, gracefully too fast for coastlines to retreat, gradually too fast for anything except catastrophic adjustment to the new thermal regime that the planet had entered. The people of the forgotten epoch would have seen the warnings if they knew where to look, the glaciers carving more frequently into seas that were slowly warming the permafrost, releasing bubbles of gas that had been locked in frozen soil for millennia, the spring floods arriving earlier and stronger each year as snowpack that had accumulated through winter melted faster under suns that climbed higher and stayed longer than the oldest memories could recall. They would have seen the migrations shifting the harvests, changing the storms growing stronger as temperature differentials between warming tropics and still frozen poles created atmospheric instabilities that discharged their energy in winds and rains, unprecedented in the experience of anyone alive. Some would have recognized these signs for what they were: the breath of the earth beginning to exhale after a long inhalation of ice, and some would have begun to prepare to move to carry their knowledge toward higher ground, where the coming waters could not reach. These were the survivors, the readers of warnings, the ancestors of everyone who came after, because they paid attention when the earth began to speak. The warnings are speaking again now. In languages we have developed sophisticated instruments to translate, but sophisticated rationalizations to ignore. The ice cores we drill from Antarctic glaciers tell us that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have risen beyond anything recorded in the past 800,000 years of carefully preserved climatic memory, and the ice sheets we monitor from satellites tell us that Greenland and Antarctica are losing mass at rates that double and redouble each decade as warming oceans gnaw at glaciers from beneath, while warming air attacks them from above. The migrations are shifting again, species moving toward poles and up mountains in search of temperatures. Their biology requires ranges contracting and expanding, according to patterns that ecologists track with growing alarm as ecosystems reorganize themselves around a new normal that has not yet finished arriving. The seasons are changing again, spring arriving weeks earlier than it did when your grandparents were young, autumn lingering longer winters losing their grip on latitudes that once measured their identity in snow that now falls as rain. We have built our civilization on coastlines that were established when sea levels stabilized after the last reset, and we have assumed those coastlines are permanent features of geography, rather than temporary configurations that persist only as long as the ice sheets that determine ocean volume remain in their current diminished state. But the ice is not permanent. It is responding to signals we are sending through an atmosphere we have altered more dramatically in 2 centuries than natural processes altered it in the preceding 10,000 years, and the response is accelerating in ways that even pessimistic projections from a decade ago failed to anticipate. The warnings are not subtle anymore. They are written in headlines about unprecedented heat waves and 1,000-year floods that occur every few years now, and wildfires that burn through landscapes too dry to resist, and hurricanes that strengthen with terrifying speed over oceans too warm to do anything but feed them energy. The Earth is speaking clearly to anyone willing to listen, and what it is saying is that another breath is beginning, another transition is underway, another reset is approaching with patience that feels like slowness to creatures who measure time in heartbeats, but moves with inexorable certainty on scales whereas centuries are moments and millennia are hours. The warning is not a threat, but an invitation to pay attention, to prepare, to preserve what matters most, to remember that we are not the first civilization to receive such signals, and will not be the last to face the choice between adaptation and erasure. The forgotten epoch had its warners too, its readers of signs, its voices crying out that the world they knew was ending, and a new world was being born in the chaos of transition. Some listened, most did not. The listeners survived and became our ancestors, and the knowledge they carried through the catastrophe seeded the civilizations we have spent this long night exploring. The choice they faced is the choice we face, and the warning they received is the warning we are receiving, written in the same language of shifting seasons and rising waters and destabilizing systems that the Earth has always used to announce that a breath is ending and another is about to begin. The ancients built their monuments as bridges between 2 realms that modern thinking has taught us to consider, separate the solid ground beneath our feet, and the wheeling heavens above our heads, the stone that endures, and the stars that turn the earth that holds our bodies, and the sky that once held our understanding of time itself. We have forgotten how to read the conversation between these realms, have lost the fluency that allowed our ancestors to see in the movements of constellations the patterns that would manifest in floods and droughts, and the slow wobble of seasons across millennia, but the monuments they left behind still encode this dialogue in alignments and proportions and orientations that speak to anyone patient enough to learn the language they were designed to preserve. The sky and the earth are not separate systems, but expressions of the same cosmic mechanics, partners in a dance choreographed by gravity and geometry, and the civilizations that understood this relationship built that understanding into stone so heavy it could not be moved, and so precise it could not be misread by those who came after. Consider the procession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis that traces a circle through the heavens over approximately 26,000 years, shifting the position of the celestial pole and changing which stars rise with the sun at the spring equinox in a cycle so gradual that centuries must pass before the shift becomes obvious to casual observers. The builders of Göbekli Tepe encoded this knowledge into their stone circles 11,600 years ago, aligning their pillars to stellar positions that would only have been accurate during the centuries when the site was active, creating a timestamp in stone that allows modern archaeologists to verify the site's age through astronomical calculation, independent of radiocarbon dating. These were not primitive hunters stumbling upon accidental alignments, but sophisticated observers who had tracked the sky long enough to understand its deepest rhythms, who knew that the heavens were a clock marking time on scales that dwarfed human lifespans, and who built monuments designed to preserve this knowledge through whatever catastrophes might erase the living traditions that had accumulated it. The Great Pyramid of Giza continues this dialogue between sky and earth with precision that still challenges our understanding of what ancient builders could achieve with the tools we believe they possessed. Its base is aligned to true north, with an accuracy of less than 4 arc minutes, a deviation so small that modern surveyors using satellite technology struggle to improve upon it. And this alignment was achieved 4,500 years ago by people who had no compass, no telescope, no instruments of measurement except careful observation of the stars accumulated over generations and transmitted through traditions we can no longer trace to their origins. The internal passages of the pyramid point to specific stars that held significance in Egyptian cosmology, and the proportions of the structure encode mathematical relationships that connect the dimensions of the monument to the dimensions of the Earth itself, as if the builders intended to create a scale model of planetary geometry frozen in limestone for future generations to decode. This was not decoration or accident, but deliberate communication, a message carved in stone and oriented to heaven by people who understood that sky and earth were aspects of a single system, and that understanding one required understanding both. The relationship between celestial mechanics and terrestrial conditions operates through mechanisms that ancient observers tracked empirically, long before modern science explained them theoretically. The Milankovitch cycles that govern ice ages operate through variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt that change the distribution of solar energy across latitudes over periods of tens and hundreds of thousands of years. And these cycles are driven by gravitational interactions between Earth and other bodies in the solar system, the same interactions that determine the positions of planets, and the timing of eclipses and the rhythms that ancient astronomers encoded in monuments and myths we have only recently learned to interpret. When the builders of Nabta Playa in the Egyptian desert created a stone circle aligned to summer solstice 7,000 years ago, they were not merely marking a convenient date for ceremonies, but documenting their understanding that the sun's position determined the patterns of rainfall and vegetation and survival that their lives depended upon, that the sky was not separate from the earth, but the control system that governed its cycles of abundance and scarcity. The floods that ended the forgotten epoch were themselves connected to celestial mechanics through chains of causation that stretch from orbital variations to ice sheet dynamics to the catastrophic releases of meltwater that reshaped coastlines and buried civilizations beneath sediment. The warming that ended the Younger Dryas and triggered the final phase of post-glacial flooding corresponded to shifts in solar insolation driven by the same orbital cycles that had initiated the Ice Age 100,000 years earlier, and the ancient observers who tracked the sky with such precision would have understood that the stars were not merely decoration but information, not merely beauty but warning, not merely mystery but mechanism. They built their monuments to preserve this understanding because they knew that knowledge of celestial cycles was knowledge of terrestrial futures, that reading the sky correctly could mean the difference between preparation and catastrophe, between survival and erasure, between carrying civilization through the reset and losing everything to the waters that rose when the ice released its long-held breath. We have instruments now that can measure axial precession to fractions of arcseconds and predict planetary positions centuries in advance and model climate dynamics with supercomputers processing data from satellites that observe the Earth, from spaces the ancients could only imagine, but we have lost something they possessed, the intuitive understanding that sky and earth are not separate subjects to be studied by separate departments in separate buildings, but aspects of a single system that must be understood holistically to be understood at all. Our specialization has given us precision. At the cost of perspective has allowed us to master details, while losing sight of patterns has produced knowledge so fragmented that no single mind can hold enough of it to see the connections that ancient observers encoded in monuments designed to preserve exactly those connections through ages of forgetting. The dialogue between sky and earth continues whether we participate in it or not, and the cycles that the ancients tracked continue to operate whether we acknowledge them or not, and the monuments they built still point towards stars that have shifted position since the stones were placed, but still mark the same relationships they were designed to preserve. The forgotten epoch understood something. We are only beginning to remember that the Earth does not orbit through empty space, but through a cosmic environment that shapes its conditions in ways that manifest across timescales too long for unassisted human memory to track, and that civilizations which wish to endure must find ways to extend their memory beyond individual lifespans into archives that can survive the resets that celestial mechanics periodically impose upon terrestrial arrangements. The sky is not above us, and the earth is not below us. They are around us, we are within them, and the relationship between them is the context within which all human history unfolds, the stage upon which all civilizations rise and fall, the framework that the builders of ancient monuments encoded in stone because they knew that stone could remember what flesh would forget, and that the sky would continue to speak to those who preserved the knowledge of how to listen. There is a feeling that visits us sometimes in the presence of ancient things, a tremor of recognition that passes through the mind like wind through curtains, disturbing the settled arrangement of assumptions, and admitting for a moment the possibility that we have stood in this place before, have faced this question before, have reached this threshold before in lives we cannot remember, but whose echoes still resonate in chambers of consciousness we do not know how to access deliberately. The Greeks had a word for this feeling, anamnesis, which they understood not as the creation of new knowledge, but as the recovery of knowledge already possessed, the remembering of truths the soul had encountered before birth, and forgotten upon entering the body, truths that education and experience could awaken but never truly originate. We dismiss this feeling now as déjà vu, as neurological glitch, as the brain misfiling present experience into memory's past tense. But the ancients trusted it as evidence of something the modern mind has trained itself to doubt, the possibility that consciousness extends beyond the boundaries of individual biography into territories where time moves differently, and memory persists across intervals that should have erased it completely. The return manifests in the strange familiarity we feel when we encounter knowledge that should be new to us, but somehow is not, concepts that click into place with a satisfaction, suggesting we're not learning them for the first time, but recognizing them from encounters we cannot consciously recall. Children who grasp mathematics with intuitive ease that cannot be explained by instruction alone. Musicians who hear compositions complete in their minds before their fingers learn to play them. Physicists who report that correct equations feel right in ways that precede verification. These experiences suggest that knowledge may circulate through channels deeper than individual learning may accumulate in reservoirs that multiple generations draw from without understanding the source. The forgotten epoch encoded its understanding in myths and monuments designed to survive the reset, and the civilizations that emerged from the silence inherited this encoding. Without remembering who had created it, experienced it as revelation rather than recovery, felt it as discovery rather than return. But perhaps all discovery is return. Perhaps the knowledge we believe we are creating has been created before lost and found and lost and found again, across cycles of civilization that stretch back further than our current framework of history permits us to imagine. The return appears in the way certain forms repeat themselves across cultures that had no contact in the pyramids, that rise in Egypt and Mexico and China and Sudan, as if the shape itself exerts an attraction on human minds, attempting to build permanently to bridge the gap between earth and sky, to create structures that will survive the resets that periodically erase everything not anchored in stone, too heavy to be moved by water or time. The pyramid is not a cultural artifact borrowed and transmitted, but an archetype arising independently wherever humans accumulate enough surplus and organization to attempt monumentality, as if the form exists in some realm of geometric possibility that builders discover rather than invent, return to rather than create for the first time. The same pattern appears in flood myths that share structural elements, too specific to be coincidental: divine warning, preparation, catastrophe, survival, renewal. As if the story itself is an archetype that surfaces whenever human memory attempts to encode the experience of civilizational reset, a template that the mind returns to because it accurately describes something that has happened repeatedly rather than something that happened once and was then imaginatively elaborated. The cycles themselves constitute the deepest return, the pattern beneath all patterns, the rhythm that ensures that nothing truly ends and nothing truly begins, but everything transforms through phases that repeat, because they express the fundamental dynamics of complex systems, organizing themselves on a planet governed by celestial mechanics and thermodynamic constraints that do not change merely because civilizations rise and fall within them. The Ice Age will return not as punishment or accident, but as the inevitable expression of orbital cycles that have been governing Earth's climate for millions of years, and will continue to do so regardless of what humans build or believe in the interglacial intervals between glacial advances. The coastlines will shift again, sometimes drowning land that civilizations have occupied for millennia, sometimes exposing land that has been beneath the waves since before human memory began. and the populations displaced by these shifts will migrate and adapt and eventually forget that the configuration of land and sea they inhabit is temporary. A pause in a cycle that will resume when the conditions that sustain it change. We are not approaching the future so much as returning to phases of a cycle that has turned before and will turn again, and the illusion of linear progress that flatters our present moment will dissolve when the turning reveals that we have been moving not forward but around. The recognition of return offers a strange comfort in the darkness of this long night, a reassurance that the mortality of civilizations is not tragedy, but participation in something larger than any individual culture can embody a process that uses civilizations as vehicles for exploring possibilities and then dissolves them back into the reservoir of potential from which new civilizations will crystallize when conditions align again. The forgotten epoch is not truly forgotten. It persists in the calendar we use and the proportions we build, and the myths we tell and the intuitions we feel when ancient knowledge resonates in minds that should not recognize it, but somehow do. We are the return of everything that came before us, the latest iteration of patterns that have been expressing themselves since the first humans looked up at the stars and felt the stirring of questions that would organize themselves into astronomy and religion and architecture and all the other frameworks through which consciousness attempts to make sense of its situation on a planet it did not create, in a cosmos it did not choose. The cycle will continue after us, as it continued after the forgotten epoch, and whatever civilizations emerge from our eventual silence will inherit from us. As we inherited from those who came before will feel the strange familiarity of knowledge they believe they are discovering for the first time will build in forms that repeat because the forms express truths deeper than any individual culture can originate. The return is not repetition, but deepening, not mere cycling, but spiraling through levels of understanding that accumulate even as the surface forms dissolve and reconstitute across the ages. Each civilization that rises from the silence after a reset carries forward what survived the previous collapse, and adds its own discoveries before passing through its own collapse into the silence from which the next civilization will rise. The pattern turns, but it also develops, evolves, explores new territories of possibility, while remaining anchored in the constraints that all civilizations share: the need for food and shelter and meaning, the vulnerability to climate and catastrophe, the capacity for knowledge, and the tendency toward forgetting. We are not trapped in the cycle, but expressed through it, not prisoners of return, but participants in a process that requires return in order to continue, that uses the dissolution of forms to create the space for new forms to emerge. The forgotten epoch returns in us. We will return in civilizations not yet imagined, and the wheel that carries us all continues to turn through darkness and light, through silence and sound, through forgetting and remembering, through endings that are always also beginnings and beginnings that are always also returns. We have travelled far tonight, you and I, descending through layers of time and sediment, and forgetting until we reached depths where the familiar story of human origins dissolved into something stranger and older and more mysterious than the textbooks prepared us to encounter. We have stood at the edges of excavation pits where foundations that should not exist wait beneath foundations we thought were the beginning, have traced the outlines of civilizations that rose and flourished and vanished so completely that only their absence remains to testify that they ever existed at all. We have followed echoes backward through millennia and forward into the present moment, where they continue to reverberate in calendars and architectures and intuitions we have stopped questioning because they have always been there as far back as anyone can remember. And now, having gathered all this knowledge, having accumulated all these fragments and anomalies and patterns, the question arises naturally in the stillness of this late hour: what do we do with what we have learned, and how does knowing change the way we rest in the uncertainty that remains? The reflection that this knowledge invites is not conclusion, but opening, not the satisfaction of answers found, but the peace that comes from accepting that some questions are larger than any answer we can formulate, and that living with mystery is not failure but maturity. We do not know who built the foundations beneath the foundations, do not know what civilization flourished in the forgotten epoch before the waters rose and the silence settled over everything they had achieved, do not know how much was lost and how much was preserved, and how much of what we consider our own invention is actually inheritance from sources we cannot trace. This not knowing could be torment if we insisted on certainty as the price of peace, but certainty was never available, and the insistence on it has caused more suffering than the mysteries it sought to resolve. The reflection that serves us better is the one that finds rest not despite uncertainty, but within it that discovers in the vastness of what we do not know a permission to stop grasping and simply be present with the questions themselves. The civilizations that came before us did not need to know everything in order to build beautifully and live meaningfully, and transmit what mattered most through catastrophes that erased everything else. They encoded their knowledge in stone and story because they understood that the future was uncertain, and that preparation for uncertainty was the closest thing to security that mortal beings could achieve. They did not paralyze themselves with anxiety about the resets they sensed approaching, but continued to build and plant and teach and love in the time they had, trusting that what deserved to survive would find ways to survive, and that what was lost was perhaps meant to be lost, meant to make room for whatever would emerge from the silence after them. Their reflection was not resignation, but acceptance, not passivity, but the active peace that comes from doing what can be done and releasing what cannot be controlled, from participating fully in the cycle, while acknowledging that the cycle is larger than any individual participation can encompass. This is the reflection that the long night offers to those who stay awake long enough to receive it, the recognition that we are small and brief and uncertain, and that this smallness and brevity and uncertainty are not obstacles to meaning but the very conditions within which meaning becomes possible. A civilization that lasted forever would have no urgency to create, no pressure to preserve, no motivation to encode its understanding in forms that could survive its own dissolution. It is precisely because everything ends that anything matters, precisely because the cycle turns that each moment within the cycle carries weight, precisely because we do not know what will survive, that we must choose carefully what we attempt to transmit. The forgotten epoch made its choices, and we are living with the results inheritors of decisions made by people who could not know what would reach us and what would be lost along the way. We will make our choices in turn, and civilizations not yet born will inherit. Whatever survives, the transitions that separate us from them, will puzzle over our fragments, as we have puzzled over fragments from the epoch before us. Let this reflection settle into your body now like warmth, settling into cold hands held near a fire, like peace, settling into a mind that has finally stopped grasping for certainties it was never going to catch. The mystery remains. The foundations beneath the foundations remain unexplained. The forgotten epoch remains forgotten in its details, even as its patterns persist in everything we are and everything we build. And this is enough. This is more than enough. This is exactly what this moment contains, and this moment is exactly where we are, and being where we are with acceptance rather than resistance is the deepest reflection any knowledge can produce. The wheel turns, the cycle continues. The breath of the earth moves in and out across timescales we cannot feel but can learn to trust, and we small and brief and beautiful in our uncertainty. Rest within the turning as the night grows deep and the questions grow quiet, and the peace that passes, understanding, settles over everything like snow falling on ancient stones that have waited a very long time for someone to sit beside them in silence and simply be present with all they have witnessed and all they have forgotten and all they continue to hold in the patience that only stone can achieve. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The descent is complete. The layers have been explored, the foundations examined, the silence listened to with patience and care. You do not need to carry any of this forward into waking memory. The words have already done their work, settling into the deeper strata of your mind like sediment, drifting to the bottom of a still lake like dust, finding its rest on surfaces that will hold it safe until some future moment calls it back into light. The foundations beneath our feet were not laid by us. The knowledge we think we discovered may simply be knowledge we remembered. The cycles that turned before us will turn after us, and the wheel that carries civilizations through their rising and fallings will continue to turn long. after tonight has faded into the silence from which all nights eventually emerge, and to which all nights eventually return. In the end, traveller, it is all right to not understand. Understanding was never the destination, only presence, only witness, only the willingness to sit with mystery without demanding that it resolve into certainty. Let gravity hold you now. Let the questions fade like stars fading into the pale edge of dawn, not disappearing, but simply becoming invisible against a brightness too vast to contain them. Your body knows how to rest. Your breath knows how to slow. The ancient stones know how to wait, and you have learned a little of their patience tonight. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again. Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch.